Tonight, we're diving into a story that the Travel Channel doesn't want you to see. Expedition Bigfoot's lead primatologist, Dr. Mireya Mayor, has just broken her silence. And what she's revealed about a banned Bigfoot video has shocked even her fellow researchers. The clip, which was allegedly confiscated during filming, was said to contain evidence so disturbing that the network refused to air it, claiming it violated broadcast safety standards. But insiders say the real reason runs much deeper. A government lockdown, blacked out memory cards, and one scientist now risking everything to tell the truth. Hit subscribe, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why Expedition Bigfoot might never return. It was supposed to be a routine night in the Pacific Northwest, just another day on location for Expedition Bigfoot. The team had split into two groups, one following vocalization readings in the valley, the other, led by Dr. Mireya Mayor, heading into the dense forest near Mount St. Helens, an area notorious for unexplained sightings. The air was thick, humid, and eerily quiet. Mireya, a world-renowned primatologist and former National Geographic explorer, had spent years chasing legends around the globe. But this night, she would capture something no scientist was prepared for. Around 2:43 a.m., Mireya's thermal drone detected movement, large, upright, and fast. Thinking it might be a bear, she ordered the team to switch to infrared and began recording. What appeared on the monitor made her stop breathing. A massive bipedal figure, at least 8 feet tall, striding across a clearing with fluid, deliberate motion. Its heat signature pulsed brighter than anything in the area, almost unnaturally warm. She whispered, "That's no human." The crew's cameras caught a few seconds before the signal cut out. When they tried to replay it, the video wouldn't load. Static, corrupted data. But the drone's onboard drive had kept a local backup. When they extracted it later, what they saw made everyone in the room go silent. The footage showed the creature pausing, turning its head toward the drone, and then vanishing into the trees in a single, unnatural leap. Mireya insisted on submitting the evidence to the network. Hours later, representatives from the Travel Channel arrived unexpectedly, taking the SD cards and warning the crew to discuss nothing publicly. According to insiders, they claimed the material contained unauthorized classified content. That was the moment Expedition Bigfoot changed forever. The footage was never broadcast. The network went dark on updates, and for the first time, Mireya Mayor began to suspect that what they encountered in those woods wasn't just a legend. It was something someone didn't want the world to see. Within 48 hours of that night, Expedition Bigfoot's entire operation was abruptly frozen. Crew members received emergency calls ordering them to pack up camp and return to the production base immediately. Drones were grounded. Cameras were collected. The show's director was told by upper management that federal oversight had stepped in for security reasons. Mireya thought it was a joke until 3 men in dark tactical gear arrived at the field base, identifying themselves only as consultants. They carried metallic cases, logged the footage drives, and sealed them with tamper-proof tags. Every digital file, every drone card, every recording, gone. The explanation given later was vague. Technical malfunction, data recovery, privacy liability. But to those who were there, it felt like something far more serious. Crew members later described an almost military-style sweep, with encrypted laptops taken and hard drives wiped remotely. One audio engineer said his laptop rebooted mid-edit with the message, "Access revoked by external administrator." Mireya tried to protest. She argued that she was the scientific lead, that any biological evidence should go to peer review, not corporate storage. The response was chilling. "This isn't your jurisdiction anymore, doctor." The next morning, production trucks were gone. Only empty tents remained where the team had camped. When Mireya contacted the Travel Channel's executive office, they refused to discuss it. The only official statement she received was that Expedition Bigfoot was going on on creative hiatus. But what haunted her most was the timing. The blackout happened mere hours after the footage was transmitted through a secured uplink. Someone else had been monitoring their signal. That was the moment Mireya realized this wasn't a cancellation. It was containment. And whatever was on that footage wasn't just Bigfoot. It was evidence of a classified encounter the government had been suppressing for decades. Weeks after the abrupt shutdown, whispers began surfacing online from inside the Expedition Bigfoot production team. A former assistant editor, under the alias Orion, claimed to have saved a single still frame from the confiscated footage before the system purge. Late one night, that frame leaked, briefly appearing on a cryptid researcher forum before it was deleted within minutes. But hundreds had already seen it, and what it showed would haunt every one of them. In the image, a massive humanoid figure stood between two pine trees, partially obscured by fog. Its proportions were all wrong, the shoulders impossibly broad, the arms nearly reaching the knees, the head sloping backward like a gorilla's, yet unmistakably human in outline. Behind it, faint red glows reflected in the brush, as though smaller eyes were peering from the darkness. What disturbed viewers most wasn't just the creature's appearance, it was the expression caught mid-motion. It wasn't running, it was watching. Within hours, the image was flagged by automatic copyright claims from an unfamiliar company called Northfield Research LLC, registered in Virginia, the same state that houses several federal intelligence facilities. Cryptid researchers noticed metadata anomalies, GPS coordinates embedded in the photo file that pointed not to the Pacific Northwest, but to an airbase near Yakima, known for classified testing grounds. When questioned about the leak, the network denied its authenticity, but sources close to the production confirmed that the lighting, terrain, and Mireya's equipment matched what was used that night. According to one sound tech, that's the exact clearing where we lost the drone feed. It's not fake, it's the frame. For a brief moment, the internet buzzed with speculation that Expedition Bigfoot had stumbled upon more than a cryptid, perhaps a classified biological entity connected to ancient DNA study. Then, almost overnight, all discussion vanished. Forums shut down, threads deleted, and users who shared the image reported being locked out of their accounts. It was as if someone, or something, was erasing every trace of it ever existing. After the leaked frame exploded online, Dr. Mireya Mayor found herself at the center of something she no longer controlled. Interview requests poured in, and rumors swirled that she was preparing to go public with what really happened in those woods. But just days later, she vanished from social media without explanation. Her verified accounts, Twitter, Instagram, even her personal website, were wiped clean, leaving only the message, temporarily deactivated for maintenance. To her followers, it looked routine. To those who knew her, it was chilling. Mireya never went silent. Privately, crew members said she had become increasingly paranoid. One close colleague revealed that Mireya told him she was being followed. White SUVs parked outside her home, phone interference, strange emails with attachments she never opened. She allegedly showed him an official-looking cease and desist letter bearing the logo of an unknown division, Office of Biological Anomalies and Extraterrestrial Phenomena. It warned her that releasing classified ecological data would be considered a national security breach. Then, in what many now call the Miami incident, Mireya was scheduled to speak at a university lecture about undiscovered primates. Moments before going on stage, two unidentified men approached event staff and asked to escort Dr. Mayor for a private discussion. Witnesses said she appeared startled, then reluctantly left with them. The lecture was abruptly canceled. Mireya didn't resurface publicly for almost 2 weeks. When she did, it was on a heavily edited network video where she appeared calm but distant, repeating the same statement. The footage was inconclusive. We found no verifiable evidence of an unidentified species. Viewers immediately noticed her tone was robotic, rehearsed. Her eyes kept shifting away from the camera, as if reading a script. Audio analysts later confirmed faint echo signatures suggesting digital manipulation in the background track. It wasn't live. It was recorded, approved, and released released under supervision. Whatever Mireya had planned to reveal had been buried, and her silence wasn't voluntary. The truth had been replaced with a broadcast-friendly lie. But behind the scenes, a small number of the crew refused to stay quiet, and what they uncovered next would prove even more disturbing. After Mireya's forced silence, the Expedition Bigfoot team began fracturing under pressure. Some members returned to their normal lives, refusing to talk. Others, however, couldn't shake what they had witnessed. The night vision footage, the missing data drives, the men who arrived unannounced claiming to be government contractors. The producers had promised that everyone's safety was guaranteed, yet within weeks, strange things started happening. A cameraman's home was broken into, nothing stolen except his external hard drives. A sound engineer received a late-night phone call where a calm, anonymous voice said only, "We know what you saw," then hung up. 3 members decided to fight back. They met secretly in a motel outside Portland, Oregon, under the guise of a production debrief. What they actually did was begin compiling every piece of evidence that survived the purge. Duplicate footage fragments stored on cloud backups, deleted radio logs, even a transcript of Mireya's last recorded satellite call. The team called themselves the Continuum, a private archive dedicated to preserving what was almost erased from history. According to one insider, what they recovered wasn't a full video, but a data stream, thermal readings showing multiple heat signatures circling the team's camp hours before the encounter. These signatures moved with intent. They flanked the group, merged, separated, and finally disappeared into a ravine that didn't exist on any official map. One frame, when enhanced, revealed a faint triangular reflection, metallic, geometric, artificial. It wasn't an animal, one former technician insisted. It was organized. The Continuum tried to contact Mireya to confirm the data, but she wouldn't answer. Her assistant eventually sent a cryptic reply. They warned her not to engage. She's being monitored. Weeks later, 2 of the Continuum members' emails were hacked. Files vanished. An encrypted message appeared in their inbox. This case is closed. Terminate all copies. But the damage was done. A handful of frames and logs had already been shared with journalists specializing in defense and aerospace black projects. One of them, under strict anonymity, confirmed that the coordinates where the readings were captured lined up perfectly with a restricted air corridor used by experimental aircraft contractors. The implication was staggering. Either Expedition Bigfoot had stumbled into a covert military test, or something much stranger had been hidden under that same cover for decades. And, if that was true, it meant Mireya and her team hadn't just encountered Bigfoot, they had crossed into a classified zone where something non-human was being observed, contained, and protected by forces far beyond television. The Continuum's discoveries didn't stay secret for long. One of their encrypted drives, disguised as a personal backup, was intercepted by what appeared to be cybersecurity contractors tied to the same shadowy agency that silenced Mireya. But before it was seized, an anonymous leaker uploaded a portion of its contents to the dark web. It wasn't the full encounter video, just 8 minutes of raw, corrupted footage. Yet what those 8 minutes contained sent shockwaves through the cryptid and UFO research community. The clip began like any other expedition feed, Mireya and her co-hosts whispering as they navigated through dense forest terrain. But as the camera panned to a clearing, the thermal lens suddenly flared white. In the static, multiple shapes could be seen moving in unison. Not random, not animalistic, but precise. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic pulse that audio experts later said matched no known wildlife, machinery, or atmospheric interference. It repeated every 13 seconds, a pattern eerily similar to low-frequency communication signals used by naval sonar. At the 4-minute mark, the feed jolted violently. A massive shape lunged past the infrared beam, 2 glowing eyes reflecting back like polished stone. Mireya's voice could be heard shouting, "It's watching us! It's behind!" before the mic cut out entirely. The next few minutes were chaos. Rustling leaves, heavy footsteps, and then silence. When the footage resumed, the timestamp had jumped ahead by exactly 8 minutes, the missing time. The final frame showed Mireya's face illuminated by a faint blue light. Terrified, confused, whispering, "They don't want this filmed." Forensics experts later determined the file had been deliberately tampered with, not corrupted, but surgically edited, metadata rewritten, time codes overwritten, and geotags replaced. However, one forensic clue remained, a faint watermark appearing in two frames that read, "Property of Northfield Systems Division 7. That same division name had already appeared on the cease and desist letter sent to Mireya weeks earlier. When questioned about the footage, both the network and Northfield denied involvement, claiming the video was a deep fake made by online pranksters. But engineers pointed out the footage predated generative AI by years. Others noted the telltale signs of analog distortion, evidence that it was filmed on real thermal cameras, not digitally recreated. Then, almost overnight, the clip vanished from every mirror site and backup link across the web. One forum moderator who had re-uploaded the footage reported receiving a visit from two polite men in suits, warning him that he was in violation of the Espionage Act. The message was clear. This wasn't about a TV show anymore. It was about national secrecy. Whatever Mireya Mayor's team filmed in those missing 8 minutes was never meant to reach the public. And the fact that every trace of it had been scrubbed, both digitally and physically, only deepened one terrifying question. What did they actually capture that night? Weeks after the black file vanished, an unlikely figure stepped out of the shadows. A retired defense biologist named Dr. Leon Vargas, who claimed he had once consulted for a government project dealing with biological anomalies of unknown taxonomy. Vargas had worked under a non-disclosure agreement at a facility in Montana in 2015. What caught investigators' attention was the logo on the documents he later shared with a journalist, the same Northfield Systems Division 7 seal that appeared on Mireya's footage. According to Vargas, the division's real mission wasn't building drones or tracking weather. It was studying extraterrestrial biome hybrids, beings he described as intermediaries between human and non-human species. In a secret online interview, Vargas spoke carefully, never revealing his face. He claimed that several of the specimens collected over the years weren't dead. They were alive, sedated, and stored within remote containment sites near former missile silos. But what truly rattled viewers was his statement that one of those creatures had escaped in 2019, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, the exact year and region Expedition Bigfoot filmed its most controversial episode. It wasn't random, he said. They were sent there to monitor the containment zone. They just didn't know it. When asked about Mireya Mayor, Vargas said he believed she had unknowingly documented one of the escaped entities, a creature that appeared humanoid but exhibited non-human locomotion patterns. You could call it a Bigfoot, he admitted, but that's not what it is. That's just the term they let the public use. The real designation, he claimed, was Specimen L-17, a life form classified under biocryptic threat protocols. Shortly after the interview aired, Vargas disappeared. His email accounts went dark. His last known correspondence was a short message sent to the journalist he spoke with. "They found me. Don't trust the footage you see next." Days later, a new debunking video suddenly surfaced online. It claimed to show the original thermal clip recreated using Hollywood-level CGI. But experts quickly tore it apart. The lighting was wrong. The thermal diffusion patterns were inconsistent. And worst of all, the supposed recreation used identical timestamps to the missing 8-minute sequence. Someone had re-uploaded the real footage under the guise of a fake. Whether Dr. Vargas had leaked it himself or someone inside Northfield wanted the truth to slip out quietly, one thing became clear. The deeper this story went, the more it seemed that the Expedition Bigfoot incident wasn't an isolated discovery. It was a classified event, buried beneath layers of denial, science, and fear. By early 2025, whispers about the Mireya Files had spread beyond the paranormal community and into mainstream media. Anonymous posts began appearing on encrypted message boards, claiming a high-definition copy of the banned footage still existed, hidden in the servers of a major television network. Then one night, everything changed. A 41-second clip surfaced on an obscure video site, uploaded under the title Raw Camera B, North Cascades. Within hours, it was re-uploaded hundreds of times before vanishing from nearly every platform, but not before thousands had seen it. In the grainy footage, Mireya could be seen standing in front of the tree line, her thermal camera trained on something massive just beyond the light. Behind her, a producer whispered, "It's moving again." A moment later, two glowing shapes darted between trees, upright, impossibly fast, yet eerily silent. The camera shook violently as something emitted a low-frequency rumble that distorted the audio waveform. Then, for less than a second, the frame froze, revealing two amber eyes reflecting light like molten glass, before the feed cut to black. Viewers were stunned. Some called it the most compelling cryptid footage ever recorded. Others said it was a psyop, a controlled leak meant to redirect public attention from something far larger. Within 12 hours, the network that had aired Expedition Bigfoot released a carefully worded statement denying the clip's authenticity. But the language was strange. It didn't call the footage fake. It called it unauthorized. That single word lit a wildfire. Every major outlet demanded answers. Talk show hosts speculated whether Mireya was under a gag order. Reddit threads broke down every frame, noting details like reflected infrared wavelengths and the faint outline of what looked like metallic implants glinting beneath the creature's skin. Then the takedowns began. The network filed dozens of copyright claims. The accounts of those who had shared the footage were suddenly suspended, sometimes within minutes. Even stranger, a few users reported in-person visits from unidentified men who demanded they delete the files for their own safety. Through all of this, Mireya stayed silent. Her social media accounts went dark, her public appearances canceled, and her PR team stopped responding to any inquiries. But 1 week later, a final update appeared briefly on her verified page before being deleted. A single line that read, "They told me not to show it, but it's already too late." That cryptic post would be the last public message ever attributed to Mireya Mayor. What came next would prove that whatever she captured wasn't just a myth. It was evidence the world was never meant to see. The Expedition Bigfoot team captured the clearest footage in the show's history, a figure moving through the forest with speed, size, and intent no known animal can match. The clip shocked the crew, forced production to halt, and left investigators shaken. Before we break down what really happened, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what the network hasn't aired yet. It started as a routine sweep, nothing unusual, nothing the Expedition Bigfoot crew hadn't done 100 times before. The team split into two groups, with Bryce monitoring sensors from the tech hub, while Russell and Mireya moved along a narrow ridge dense with fir trees and thick underbrush. Earlier in the day, the drone operator picked up a strange thermal hit, too tall, too wide, and moving too smoothly to be a bear. But the image was distorted, and the team dismissed it as atmospheric interference. No one knew that the same figure would return after dark, and this time it would step into view. Just after 11 p.m., the woods fell silent. Not quieter, silent. Birds stopped calling. Crickets cut off mid-chirp. Even the wind died. Russell whispered into his mic that the air felt charged, the same way lightning builds before a storm. Then, a seismic sensor, placed earlier to track large animal movement, triggered 3 consecutive alerts. Each impact hit harder than the last, spaced in a pattern that suggested deliberate steps, heavy, slow, calculated. The data coming into Bryce's monitor showed weight far above any known wildlife in the region. Russell signaled the drone pilot to reposition the infrared unit overhead. The drone adjusted, scanning between trees, catching only faint movement, branches shifting, leaves trembling, but no visible source. Mireya reported feeling watched, her voice tightening as she scanned the tree line with night vision. On a second monitor, Bryce saw something new, a shape breaking the thermal line. Not a blob, not a glitch, a form, upright, broad, moving with intent. Then it happened. Between 2 trees roughly 40 yards from Russell's position, something stepped forward. The camera caught it, fully, cleanly, unmistakably. A massive silhouette, shoulders impossibly wide, head high above the brush line. It moved with a smoothness no heavy animal should have. And then, as if realizing it had been seen, the figure froze. The camera recorded every second. This wasn't another blur. This wasn't a heat distortion. For the first time, the Expedition Bigfoot crew had captured clear footage of something alive and terrifyingly real. Back at the mobile command unit, Bryce Johnson replayed the clip again and again, each time hoping the figure would resolve into something familiar. An elk rising on its hind legs, a hunter caught in night vision, even a bear brushing against a tree. But the more he zoomed in, the more impossible the footage became. The outline was precise, shoulders too squared for any quadruped, arms noticeably long, nearly reaching to the knees. The stride length measured at almost 4 feet. No animal in the region matched these proportions, not even close. Russell returned to base camp first, visibly shaken. He didn't speak until Bryce turned the monitor toward him. When he saw the paused frame, an enormous silhouette paused mid-step, Russell exhaled hard and whispered, "That's not a bear." It wasn't fear in his voice. It was recognition, like a tracker finally confirming the creature behind the prints he'd followed for years. Mireya arrived moments later, and her reaction was even more telling. She leaned in, studying the limb placement, posture, and gait. Her background in primate behavior made the image more disturbing. The figure moved like an ape, but none existed in North America. Not at this size, and not in this terrain. Then they played the audio. A low-frequency rumble, barely audible to human ears, vibrated beneath the footage. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't wind. It was rhythmic, almost like a sub-harmonic vocalization. Mireya's expression changed immediately. Certain primates communicate using low infrasound to assert dominance or signal territorial claims. If this creature was doing the same, it meant one thing. It knew the team was there. The crew's internal chat lit up as the drone operator sent a message. "Look at the eyes." Bryce hesitated, but zoomed further. When the figure briefly turned its head, 2 small reflective points flashed back at the camera, positioned further apart than any known mammal. This wasn't normal red-eye reflection. It was something else entirely, something suggesting binocular vision designed for tracking. The final moment sealed it. As the figure stepped behind the trees, the thermal signature didn't fade. It burst, as if the creature's body temperature spiked, or it exerted sudden force. The reading jumped faster than any natural animal response. For the first time in the show's history, the crew wasn't debating possibilities. They were staring at evidence that should not exist. With the footage confirmed as authentic, the team made the rare decision to pursue in real time. Normally, any clear sighting forced an immediate strategic retreat, but this was different. If they hesitated, the creature would vanish, leaving nothing but another unsolved mystery. Bryce directed Russell and Mireya to move in carefully from opposite angles, hoping to triangulate the creature's path while avoiding direct confrontation. Every step they took was measured, deliberate, and painfully slow. The forest responded almost instantly. As Russell advanced, the underbrush shifted, not violently, but with a rhythm that suggested something large pacing parallel to him. Every time he stopped, the movement stopped as well. Every time he stepped forward, the unseen presence resumed. It was mirroring him, tracking him. The realization tightened his chest, but he pressed on, whispering updates into his mic. Mireya, on a lower slope, reported something equally disturbing. 3 stones landing near her feet, one after another, tossed from an unseen position deeper in the woods. None were thrown with force. They simply dropped into the brush, as if meant as a signal rather than a threat. Primates sometimes use this behavior to warn intruders. The seismic sensors spiked again, this time with a different pattern. Instead of heavy, deliberate steps, the readings now showed short bursts of movement, almost like something darting across the forest floor with unnatural speed. Bryce watched the data scroll across his screen and realized something chilling. The creature wasn't retreating. It was circling, studying the team as they attempted to approach. Thermal scans from the drone overhead confirmed this. Instead of heading away from the investigators, the heat signature looped around the ridge and reappeared behind Russell, close enough that the drone detected direct body heat through the canopy. Russell didn't hear a sound, didn't feel a breath, didn't sense a presence. But the drone operator insisted. Something massive stood in the shadows behind him for nearly 5 seconds before vanishing again. Mireya's situation escalated even faster. Her audio equipment picked up a vocalization, deep, resonant, almost like a throated hum. The sound vibrated through her chest rather than her ears. A frequency felt more than heard. Animals don't vocalize like this, not in the Cascades, not anywhere near this pitch. As she whispered into her mic that she was backing out, her voice shook for the first time in her career. The creature wasn't fleeing from them. It was herding them, studying their moves, guiding their path, and demonstrating intelligence far beyond any known primate. As the creature continued circling the team, Bryce ordered the drone to pull back and widen its radius. The hope was to capture a full-body thermal outline, something clear enough to compare against known species. What the drone recorded instead made Bryce's stomach drop. The heat signature wasn't just large, it fluctuated in a way no animal should. The torso glowed brighter than the limbs, as if the creature's core temperature surged with adrenaline or intention. This wasn't a stable biological pattern. It looked more like controlled bursts of energy. Russell, still moving along the ridge, spotted something unusual ahead. A tree, thick, mature, solid, began to sway. Even though no wind was present, the movement wasn't random. It rocked once, twice, and then bent sharply, like something massive had gripped it. Russell raised his thermal monocular and saw a shape behind the trunk, a tall, upright form leaning against it, partially hidden. The upper body was unmistakable, shoulders that sloped forward, a head that darted slightly, as if checking multiple angles. What happened next was caught by both Russell's camera and the drone above. The creature stepped out, fully, deliberately, into an open patch of forest, illuminated by moonlight. For the first time in Expedition Bigfoot history, the team captured a full, unobstructed silhouette, broad chest, long arms, and a posture too human to be dismissed as an animal. But there was something worse. It stood still, unmoving, as if intentionally presenting itself. It didn't look startled or threatened. It looked aware, observant, almost curious. Then the eyes reflected again, not with the dull glow of typical nighttime eye shine, but with a sharp, almost metallic glint. 2 points of light fixed directly on Russell. The camera jittered as Russell instinctively stumbled back. The creature responded instantly. It tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement, like a predator assessing whether the human in front of it was a threat. The mic on Russell's vest picked up his breathing, rapid and uneven. He whispered that the creature was testing boundaries. Before he could finish the sentence, the figure moved, not with the heavy stomping of a bear, nor the bounding leaps of a deer. It glided, a smooth, controlled motion that covered distance too quickly for its size. In 3 strides, it was out of sight, but the terror didn't end there. As Russell tried to regroup, a loud crack echoed behind him, the unmistakable sound of something snapping a branch thicker than a human forearm. It wasn't a random break, it was a warning, a message, a demonstration of strength. The footage captured everything, and for the first time, the team realized the creature wasn't just avoiding contact, it was managing the encounter, deciding how close the humans could get. Russell's warning crack still echoed when Bryce issued a direct order: fall back to the rendezvous point immediately. The team had enough evidence to review, and the creature's behavior was growing unpredictable, but the forest had other plans. As Russell and Mireya began withdrawing, the seismic sensors triggered again, this time in rapid succession, forming a pattern that mimicked pursuit. Heavy impacts, fast impacts. Something was moving parallel to them, matching their retreat pace. Step for step, Mireya radioed that she could hear breathing. Not her own, not an echo, but a low, guttural exhale coming from the darkness beside the trail. Every time she stopped, it stopped. Every time she moved, it resumed. The audio equipment strapped to her pack captured the sound clearly. It wasn't the breath of a bear or elk. It was too steady, too controlled, and filled with an unmistakable presence of intent. Back at base, Bryce stared at the live drone feed with growing unease. The thermal signature reappeared behind the crew, just 60 yards back, partially obscured by trees. The creature wasn't fleeing anymore. It was shadowing them, tracking their movements with unnerving precision. The drone operator tried to spotlight the figure, but every attempt failed. The creature dipped into coverage the instant the drone adjusted, as if it understood the angles, the blind spots, the limitations of the equipment. Russell whispered that he could feel the ground tremble beside him, not shaking, pulsing, like something massive stepped softly but powerfully in the soil. Then came the moment that rattled the entire team. A rock the size of a baseball arced through the darkness and landed mere feet from Russell's position. This wasn't a stumble or dislodged debris. It was a throw, calculated, accurate, and forceful enough to send a clear message. Bryce called for an emergency extraction route, but the creature's behavior escalated. The thermal feed showed it moving in short bursts, fast, strategic, almost tactical. It would rush forward 30 feet, stop completely, then reposition again. Predators do this when driving prey. The fear shifted into something colder. The creature wasn't reacting to them. It was controlling their path. As the team approached a narrow canyon that led back to camp, the drone captured a moment that made Bryce's voice crack through the radio. The creature stepped into view again, this time at the canyon mouth, blocking the exit for a split second before vanishing into shadow. It wasn't an accident. It was a test, a demonstration of dominance. The message was unmistakable. This is my territory. You leave when I decide. The crew had stumbled into a chase, neither side fully initiated, but one, the creature, fully controlled. When the team finally made it back to camp, shaken and breathless, Bryce immediately ordered the footage uploaded to the command system for a full-frame analysis. This was standard protocol after any major sighting, but within minutes, it became clear that nothing about this night was going to be standard. The moment the clip stabilized on the screen, every person in the room went silent. The figure wasn't just visible. It was defined with musculature, posture, and movement that could not be dismissed as misidentification. The first step was running the video through a motion enhancement algorithm, something typically used to sharpen fast-moving wildlife. But when the program attempted to track the creature's limb movement, the system glitched, dropping frames, redrawing outlines, struggling to classify the figure as anything biologically familiar. The algorithm's species identification function, meant to categorize animals by movement pattern, returned a result the team had never seen before. No match, unknown biped. The second analysis, thermal reconstruction, was even stranger. The creature's core temperature spiked during moments of stillness rather than exertion. This went against every known mammalian response. Bryce rewound the clip to the exact moment the creature tilted its head toward Russell. The thermal reading jumped dramatically, as if the creature's internal temperature responded to awareness or focus. Mireya suggested this could indicate a biological mechanism not yet documented, a way of regulating heat for speed or sensory advantage. Then came the part that made Bryce lean back in his chair, stunned. When he slowed the footage to 1/10 speed, something subtle but unmistakable emerged. The creature's facial shape. The outline showed a pronounced brow ridge, sloped forehead, and a jawline too elongated for a human. But the most disturbing detail was its mouth. As Russell stumbled and gasped, the creature's lips moved, not in a snarl, not in a roar, but in a small, controlled motion that looked almost like mimicry, as if it were imitating the sound of human breathing. The audio track confirmed this. Under Russell's mic feed, buried beneath the forest noise, was a faint exhale that matched his own rhythm, about half a second delayed. Not animalistic, not accidental, intentional, coordinated. The creature wasn't just following them, it was listening, responding, mirroring, a level of behavioral intelligence that pushed the situation into terrifying new territory. When Bryce isolated the eyes, enhancement filters picked up something reflective, not caused by camera glare. A thin, wet sheen, similar to primate tapetum, but positioned differently. The spacing was wider than a gorilla's, but narrower than a moose's. It suggested stereoscopic depth perception, identical to apex predators. The more they slowed the footage, the clearer one conclusion became. This creature wasn't just avoiding detection, it was studying the team, perhaps even assessing them. And for the first time in the show's history, the biggest fear wasn't that they had captured Bigfoot on camera, but that Bigfoot now understood the crew's methods as well. While Bryce and the tech team analyzed the footage frame by frame, Russell and Mireya stepped outside the command unit to collect themselves. The night was still unnaturally quiet, as if the forest had not yet recovered from whatever presence had moved through it. Russell kept glancing toward the tree line, replaying the creature's head tilt in his mind. There was something calculated in that gesture, something that suggested not just awareness, but intention. Mireya, normally the voice of scientific grounding, admitted in a low voice that the creature's behavior matched advanced primate strategies used only when observing another intelligent group. "It wasn't escaping," she whispered. "It was evaluating us." Inside the command unit, the drone operator called Bryce over with shaky urgency. He had gone back through raw drone telemetry, data that wasn't part of the video feed but recorded automatically. As he overlaid the movement logs, a chilling pattern emerged. The creature had been tracking the entire team long before anyone realized. Not from one direction, but from 3 separate points throughout the night. It had moved in arcs, repositioning itself strategically around the investigators, like a tactician, like a hunter that understood perimeter control. Mireya rushed back inside as Bryce projected the creature's movement paths onto a digital map. The lines traced along ridges, dips, and natural cover points, routes used by predators who understand terrain advantage. But the creature had also paused at unusual intervals, stopping at elevated positions with clear sightlines toward the team's flashlights and gear. These pauses weren't random. They were observation posts. The creature had been watching them closer and longer than anyone realized. Then came the most unsettling discovery. When the team synced the seismic sensor timestamps with the drone footage, they realized the creature manipulated its weight to control what the sensors detected. During pursuit, it moved heavily. During observation, it moved lightly, sometimes registering no impact at all. This wasn't instinct. It was adjustment, control, conscious alteration of pressure to minimize detection. No known animal performs this behavior, but military personnel do. Experienced hunters do. This creature understood more than movement. It understood stealth. The realization rippled through the room. They were not tracking it. It had been tracking them the entire night. As the crew debated their next steps, a sudden audio ping interrupted the panic. One of the remote microphones, left near the ridge, picked up a deep, resonant vocalization. Not a growl, not a roar. A long, low harmonic pulse that vibrated through the equipment. The pitch matched the subharmonic tones recorded earlier, but this time, it carried a different pattern. 3 pulses. Pause. 2 pulses. Another pause. Almost like a signal. Almost like communication. And as the audio repeated, a cold truth settled in the room. The creature wasn't just reacting to the team. It was sending a message back. As the harmonic pulses echoed through the speakers, the entire command unit froze. The sound wasn't random. It followed structure, timing, spacing, and modulation too deliberate to be an accident. Bryce ordered an immediate comparison against known animal calls, but the database returned the same result the motion algorithm had earlier. No match. Unknown source. Mireya listened closely, then offered a chilling thought. Some primates use patterned vocal signals not to warn, but to coordinate. If the pulses were communication, then the creature wasn't alone. Before that idea could settle, the ridge microphone captured something else. Movement. Not one source, but 2, then 3. Heavy impacts spaced across different points of the forest, forming a semicircle around the abandoned sensor site. The creature they filmed might have been the one that revealed itself, but it wasn't the only one present. The realization hit with a weight none of the crew expected. The figure captured on camera seemed almost like a scout, not the dominant presence. A tester, an observer, and whatever sent the harmonic pulse might have been answering it. When the drone operator reviewed the final 10 minutes of thermal footage, he found a frame that made him step back from the monitor. There was a second heat signature, smaller but distinctly upright, watching from higher ground. It never moved, never approached. It simply stood still, observing everything below. Bryce immediately flagged the footage as highly sensitive. This was the moment the network would later refuse to air. The final blow came when the Ridge microphone recorded one last vocalization, a low, rising hum that matched the earlier pattern, but with a new pulse at the end, a fourth tone. Mireya's voice trembled as she translated the implication. The pattern had changed because the situation had changed. The creature now knew it had been filmed. Bryce shut down the equipment and ordered everyone back inside camp. For the first time in the show's history, the crew agreed without argument. The night wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a warning. As the footage was sealed for review, one thought echoed through every investigator's mind. If this was the creature willing to be seen, what were the ones still hiding capable of?
Tonight, we're stepping into a story that was never meant to leave the cutting room floor. During filming of Expedition Bigfoot, lead investigator Mireya Mayor reportedly captured footage so disturbing that production was halted almost overnight. Memory cards were confiscated, files were locked down, and what was supposed to be just another night in the field turned into a silence that still hasn't been explained. Officially, the network called it a creative pause. Unofficially, insiders describe something far more serious: outside intervention, erased data, and a scientist who suddenly stopped speaking publicly. This isn't just about Bigfoot, and it isn't just about a TV show. It's about what happens when evidence crosses a line someone else has already drawn. Before we break down what was filmed, what vanished, and why this case may never be revisited on television, make sure you're subscribed, because once you hear how deep this goes, you'll understand why this story didn't disappear by accident. What happened during that Expedition Bigfoot shoot didn't begin with panic or chaos. It began quietly, the way most serious investigations do. Late at night, minimal movement, a sense that something was off long before anyone could explain why. The team had worked this terrain before: dense forest, uneven ground, heavy canopy. But that night felt different. Even experienced crew members commented on how the sound seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mireya Mayor was leading one of the units, focused, methodical, treating the night like any other data collection operation. Shortly after midnight, thermal readings began showing irregular movement patterns near the tree line. Not random heat signatures, not animals drifting in and out of range. These readings were deliberate, appearing, stopping, repositioning. Mireya initially assumed equipment interference or overlapping wildlife movement, but the patterns didn't match anything in her field experience. When the drone camera was adjusted and locked onto the clearing, the feed briefly stabilized, and then everyone froze. On screen was a tall, upright figure moving with balance and intent, not running, not charging, walking. Its heat signature was unusually intense, brighter than surrounding wildlife, yet oddly controlled. The figure paused near the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by trees, and turned its head toward the drone. That moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Enough for silence to fall across the monitoring tent. Enough for someone to whisper, "That's not supposed to be there." Then the feed dropped. No warning, no gradual signal loss. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. Static replaced video. Audio spiked, then cut entirely. When the systems rebooted, timestamps had jumped forward several minutes. No one remembered giving commands. No one recalled moving. The gap couldn't be explained. Mireya immediately ordered all local backups secured. She wanted the data preserved before anyone could touch it. That's when the first red flag appeared. The drone's onboard storage still held fragments of the encounter. Incomplete, distorted, but undeniably real. Enough to confirm the figure wasn't a visual artifact or misread thermal bloom. Within hours before sunrise, production leadership was contacted by higher-level executives. By midday, the tone had changed completely. What had started as a routine expedition was now being treated as a liability, not because it was fake, but because it wasn't. By morning, the atmosphere around the expedition had changed completely. What should have been a routine data review turned into closed-door conversations and unanswered questions. Mireya expected scientific scrutiny, verification. What she didn't expect was silence. Calls went unreturned. Messages were acknowledged without answers. And when production leadership finally spoke, it wasn't about the footage itself. It was about procedure. The first instruction came quietly: halt all filming until further notice. No explanation, no timeline, just stop. Equipment was powered down, drones grounded, and memory cards cataloged for temporary review. Mireya pushed back. insisting that any biological anomaly fell under her scientific jurisdiction. The response was short and unsettling. This was no longer an editorial decision. It was administrative. Less than 24 hours later, unfamiliar personnel arrived at the field base. They didn't wear network branding. They didn't introduce themselves as producers. They carried hard cases, clipboards, and spoke in precise, rehearsed language. Their request wasn't framed as optional. All recording media was to be surrendered immediately. Drones, camera cards, audio logs, even personal backups. One crew member later said it felt less like a production pause and more like a controlled sweep. Mireya objected openly. She demanded to know who authorized the confiscation and where the data would be taken. One of the men responded without raising his voice. "This material is no longer cleared for broadcast or independent analysis." That sentence ended the discussion. From that moment on, nothing belonged to the team. By that evening, digital access began disappearing. Cloud folders were locked. Editing systems flagged errors. An audio engineer reported his laptop rebooting mid-session, returning with files missing and permissions revoked. Another crew member noticed timestamps altered on backups they hadn't touched. The data wasn't just being collected, it was being rewritten. Officially, the network would later describe the shutdown as a technical issue paired with creative reassessment, but those on site knew better. You don't erase footage this aggressively unless someone is afraid of what it shows. And as Mireya stood in a clearing that was now silent again, one truth became impossible to ignore. The investigation hadn't ended. It had been taken over. For a brief window of time, everyone believed the evidence was gone for good. The confiscated drives, the wiped systems, the locked folders, it all seemed airtight. Whatever had been captured that night had been swallowed by corporate silence. And yet, something survived. Not a full video. Not a clean backup, just a fragment that wasn't supposed to be there at all. Days after the shutdown, a former assistant editor, someone low enough in the hierarchy to be overlooked, discovered a cached still frame buried deep inside a temporary render folder. It hadn't been flagged, hadn't been encrypted, and hadn't been scrubbed during the purge. One single image, automatically generated during a background process before access was revoked. A digital ghost. The frame showed a clearing choked with fog, trees barely visible at the edges. In the center stood a tall, upright shape. Its proportions were wrong in a way that was immediately unsettling. The shoulders were too wide. The arms hung too long. The head sloped back at an angle that didn't match human anatomy, yet the stance was unmistakably bipedal. It wasn't caught mid-run or mid-attack. It was standing still, watching. What disturbed those who saw it most wasn't the shape itself. It was the posture. The figure wasn't reacting to the camera. It wasn't startled. Its head was slightly tilted, as if assessing the equipment observing it. As if it understood it was being watched and had chosen not to hide. The editor shared the frame privately with two trusted colleagues. Within hours, it had been copied, renamed, and passed along through encrypted messages. Then something strange happened. The file began disappearing from devices without being deleted. One recipient swore it vanished while he was looking at it. Another found the file name still present, but the data inside reduced to 0 bytes. It was as if the image was being hunted. When the frame briefly surfaced on a closed research forum, it lasted less than 10 minutes before being taken down by an automated copyright claim filed by a company no one recognized. Not the network, not the production company, a third party, one registered to a Virginia address tied to defense contracting offices. That was when the whispers changed. This wasn't damage control. This wasn't embarrassment. This was containment. And the single surviving frame became proof that what Mireya's team encountered wasn't a mistake. It was something, someone else already knew existed. After the frame vanished, attention quietly shifted to one person, Mireya Mayor herself. Not publicly, not in headlines, but behind closed doors. Interviews she had already agreed to were suddenly canceled. Academic appearances were postponed without explanation. Even colleagues who had known her for years noticed something was wrong. She stopped answering messages. Calls went to voicemail. Emails received polite, delayed replies that said nothing at all. To the public, it looked like a routine break. To those close to her, it felt forced. One production assistant later recalled that Mireya had confided in him days after the shutdown. She said she'd been warned, not threatened directly, but advised, that discussing the footage could have serious consequences. Not professional consequences, legal ones, national ones. She was told the material fell outside normal scientific discovery and into a category she wasn't authorized to address. When she asked who made that determination, she was given no names, only an instruction: stop. Things escalated quickly. A scheduled university lecture on undiscovered primates was abruptly pulled from the calendar hours before it was set to begin. Event staff said 2 men had arrived early, requesting a private conversation with her. Witnesses described Mireya leaving the building with them, visibly shaken. The lecture never happened. No explanation was given. When she finally reappeared publicly, it was in a short, heavily edited network video. Calm lighting, neutral background, controlled tone. She stated that no verifiable evidence had been found and that the investigation had yielded inconclusive results. Viewers immediately noticed how unlike her it felt. Her cadence was stiff. Her eyes drifted off camera repeatedly. Audio specialists later noted faint compression artifacts suggesting the video had been altered before release. Behind the scenes, crew members said she was furious, not afraid. She believed the footage represented a genuine biological anomaly and deserved scientific review, but every path forward was blocked. Journals wouldn't respond. Conferences declined submissions. Even private discussions seemed to disappear before they started. The message was clear without being spoken. Mireya could continue her career, as long as she pretended that night never happened, and the fact that a respected scientist was silenced so efficiently told everyone else something terrifying. Whatever had stepped into that clearing wasn't just unknown, it was protected. After Mireya Mayor's silence became impossible to ignore, the rest of the Expedition Bigfoot team began to notice changes that went far beyond a canceled shoot. It wasn't just the footage that disappeared. The paper trail vanished with it. Call logs were missing. Emails referencing the incident returned error messages. Even internal production documents were quietly rewritten, removing entire dates from the schedule as if that expedition had never occurred. Crew members who tried to talk about the incident informally were warned to stop asking questions, not by executives they recognized, but by legal representatives they'd never interacted with before. New non-disclosure agreements were issued far stricter than anything previously signed. These didn't just restrict discussion of unaired content, they prohibited referencing field anomalies, third-party intervention, and external oversight. Language that had no place in a normal television contract. Then the personal incident started. One cameraman reported a break-in at his home. Nothing valuable was taken. No electronics, no cash. The only thing missing was a small external hard drive he used for off-site backups. A sound engineer received a late-night call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end didn't threaten him. It simply said, "You already gave us what we needed," and hung up. Another crew member claimed his editing laptop locked itself during a routine session, displaying a message that read, "Access revoked by administrator." At first, some tried to explain it away as paranoia, stress, coincidence, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Everyone affected had been present during the night of the encounter. Everyone else was left alone. A small group of crew members decided to quietly compare notes, not over email, not over phones, in person. They met in a motel outside Portland under the excuse of a production debrief. What they discovered confirmed their worst fear. They weren't dealing with a network cleanup. They were dealing with coordinated suppression. Fragments of data still existed: corrupted audio logs, partial telemetry, thermal readings that showed multiple large heat signatures circling the camp hours before the sighting. These weren't random movements. They flanked the team, advanced, with intent. That was the moment the crew understood the truth. Expedition Bigfoot hadn't crossed into dangerous territory by accident. They had walked into something that already had watchers, and those watchers were now watching them. When the remaining crew quietly began comparing what little data they still had, a disturbing picture started to form. This wasn't just about a single figure caught on thermal for a few seconds. The encounter was only the most visible moment in a pattern that had been building long before that night. Recovered telemetry from the drone showed repeated signal interference beginning hours earlier, not random static, not environmental noise. The interference appeared in timed bursts, always lasting the same duration, always occurring when the drone crossed specific points in the airspace. When one technician overlaid those interference points on a topographical map, something chilling emerged. The disruptions formed a loose perimeter around the team's camp, almost like a boundary. Thermal logs painted an even stranger picture. Multiple heat signatures appeared intermittently around the perimeter throughout the night. They didn't behave like animals. They didn't roam. They didn't chase prey. They moved in short, controlled paths, stopping and starting as if reacting to something unseen. At one point, 3 signatures converged near the tree line, merged into a single heat mass, then separated again minutes later. No known wildlife pattern matched that behavior. Audio fragments recovered from corrupted files revealed low-frequency pulses embedded beneath normal ambient sound. Most viewers would never notice them, but when isolated and slowed down, the pulses followed a precise rhythm. Every 13 seconds, repeating, consistent. Audio engineers noted that the frequency range didn't align with wind, insects, machinery, or known animal calls. It also didn't behave like random interference. It behaved like signaling. One technician made a connection that stopped the room cold. The pulse interval matched communication timing used in certain long-range tracking systems. Not civilian, military, experimental. That didn't mean the sound was man-made, but it suggested something operating with structure, not instinct. Even more unsettling was what happened when the team tried to reprocess the data. Files that should have been recoverable degraded further each time they were open, as if repeated access caused decay. One engineer described it as the data-resisting analysis. Whether that was a technical anomaly or something else, no one could say. By the end of that meeting, the crew reached an unspoken agreement. The footage wasn't erased because it was confusing. It was erased because it was coherent. It showed intent, awareness, and coordination. And whatever they encountered wasn't reacting like an animal being discovered. It was reacting like something that already knew it was being observed and allowed itself to be seen. By the time the crew finished assembling what little data remained, one reality had become impossible to ignore. There was no safe way forward. Not scientifically, not legally, and not personally. Whatever Expedition Bigfoot had stumbled into wasn't something that could be revisited, debated, or slowly unpacked over future seasons. The cost of continuing had already become clear. Attempts to escalate the findings through proper scientific channels quietly failed. Emails to research institutions went unanswered. Informal conversations with colleagues ended abruptly once the topic was raised. One crew member later admitted that a longtime academic contact warned him off record to stop pursuing the material entirely. This isn't a discovery, he was told. It's a boundary. At the network level, the shift was just as stark. Show outlines that once encouraged deeper investigation were rewritten to remove anything resembling direct encounters. Language was softened. Stakes were reduced. The emphasis moved away from evidence and toward atmosphere, not because the producers wanted it that way, but because that was the only version still allowed to exist. Privately, some team members discussed walking away altogether. They had families, careers, lives that suddenly felt exposed. The realization that unknown parties could access personal devices, track movements, and erase data without explanation changed how everyone viewed their role. This wasn't about fear of ridicule, it was fear of attention. The most telling moment came when one crew member asked a simple question during a closed production call. If this isn't real, why are we being treated like it is? No one answered. The truth was never officially denied. It was simply made unreachable. And so the investigation didn't end with a conclusion. It ended with containment. The show continued, but the story didn't. Viewers never saw the moment that changed everything. Never heard the sounds buried beneath the audio. Never saw the frame that shouldn't exist. All that remained was absence, a gap in the narrative that felt heavier than any on-screen reveal. By choosing silence, the people in control made one thing clear. Whatever stepped into that clearing wasn't meant to be studied publicly. And the most unsettling possibility wasn't that it existed. It was that someone already knew it did. Long after filming stopped and the crew scattered, one question refused to die. Why Mireya Mayor? Of all the people involved, she was the one with the strongest scientific footing, the one most capable of contextualizing what had been seen. And yet, she was also the one who went silent the fastest. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. In private conversations with colleagues before cutting off contact, Mireya reportedly made one statement that never left the people who heard it. She didn't say they had found Bigfoot. She didn't say they had found a new species. She said, "What we saw doesn't fit the tree." In biology, the tree is everything. Taxonomy, evolution, lineage. If something doesn't fit, it means it didn't branch naturally from what came before. It means the framework breaks. That idea explains the reaction better than any cover story. A misidentified animal could be debated, a hoax could be dismissed, but something that behaves with coordination, signaling, awareness of surveillance, and physical traits that don't align with known evolutionary paths. That isn't folklore, that's a problem. Mireya understood that going public without absolute control of the narrative would invite ridicule at best and career destruction at worst. But what seemed to stop her wasn't fear of backlash. It was the realization that the evidence didn't belong to science anymore. Once federal contractors appeared, once data was seized under administrative authority, the matter shifted domains. From research to security, from curiosity to containment. One former associate claimed Mireya was offered a choice: continue her work, access funding, maintain credibility, or challenge the decision and lose everything. She chose survival, not silence. There's a difference. Silence implies consent. Survival implies pressure. In the months that followed, she redirected her focus to safer, established research. Publicly, she moved on. Privately, she stopped fieldwork involving remote forests entirely. She never corrected the official explanation, but she never fully endorsed it either. Sometimes the loudest warning isn't spoken. It's when someone who spent their life chasing the unknown suddenly decides there are things that should not be followed again. Years have passed, but the absence left by that night still lingers. The missing footage was never recovered, the encounter was never acknowledged, and Expedition Bigfoot quietly moved on without ever explaining what changed. But silence doesn't erase impact, it preserves it. What makes this case unsettling isn't just the possibility that something unknown was filmed, it's the response, the speed, the precision, the authority with which evidence was removed and people were silenced. Those actions don't follow curiosity, they follow familiarity. If what Mireya Mayor's team encountered was harmless, it wouldn't require containment. If it was imaginary, it wouldn't demand erasure. And if it was misunderstood wildlife, it wouldn't trigger outside intervention at all. The most disturbing possibility is also the simplest. Whatever stepped into that clearing had been seen before, documented before, studied before, and carefully kept out of public reach. And that leaves one final question. Not about Bigfoot, not about television, but about us. If something like this can be hidden so completely, how much else have we already been taught not to see? A banned episode of Expedition Bigfoot has surfaced after years of being deliberately hidden from the public, and what it contains is unlike anything this show has ever produced. The footage was pulled before it ever aired, and the people closest to it have been silent ever since. Tonight we break down exactly what was captured, why it was buried, and why it is finally coming to light. If you are new here, subscribe now because this is one you cannot afford to miss. Expedition Bigfoot was never like the other shows. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it separated itself from every other Bigfoot program that had come before it by doing something none of them had ever seriously attempted. It treated the search for Bigfoot as a legitimate scientific investigation, not a campfire ghost story, not a group of enthusiasts wandering through the woods with flashlights and night vision cameras hoping to get lucky. A real structured, methodical investigation backed by technology that most research institutions could only dream of having access to in the field. The team they assembled reflected that intention from the very beginning. Mireya Mayor brought decades of field primatology to the expedition. Ronnie LeBlanc came in with years of on-the-ground research and a deep understanding of Bigfoot behavior patterns across North America. Russell Accord brought survivalist expertise and a no-nonsense approach to evidence collection that kept the team grounded when things got strange. And Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific background gave the entire operation a credibility that the Bigfoot research community had been starving for. Together they used military-grade thermal imaging, acoustic monitoring arrays, predictive behavioral algorithms, and DNA collection protocols that mirrored those used in mainstream wildlife research. The results they produced in their early seasons were compelling enough to attract serious attention from people outside the typical paranormal audience. Biologists, wildlife researchers, former military personnel with backgrounds in tracking and surveillance. People who would never have tuned into a standard cryptid hunting show were watching Expedition Bigfoot and taking it seriously. That reputation made what happened next all the more significant, because when a show that has worked that hard to establish scientific credibility suddenly pulls an entire episode without explanation and scrubs any reference to it from their promotional materials and episode guides, the silence itself becomes a story. The network said nothing officially. The production company said nothing. The cast said nothing. An episode that should have aired simply did not, and the space it left behind was filled with questions that nobody in an official capacity was willing to answer. That silence has lasted for years. Until now. The banned episode was filmed during what multiple sources close to the production have described as the most intense and unsettling expedition the Expedition Bigfoot team had ever undertaken. The location was deep in the Pacific Northwest in a stretch of wilderness that the team's behavioral analysis software had flagged as one of the highest probability zones for Bigfoot activity on the entire continent. The algorithm they used cross-referenced historical sighting reports, terrain mapping, food source availability, water proximity, and seasonal migration patterns to identify corridors where the likelihood of an encounter was statistically significant. This particular location had scored higher than anywhere they had ever investigated before, and the production team made the decision to commit significant resources to the expedition as a result. They brought in additional equipment. They extended the planned timeline in the field. They brought in a consulting scientist who had not appeared on the show before and whose involvement was never publicly announced or credited. By all accounts, the early days of the expedition were unremarkable. The team set up base camp, deployed their sensor arrays, and began their standard protocols. But crew members who were present during those first nights have since described an atmosphere on the ground that felt different from anything they had experienced during previous seasons. The forest around the camp was quieter than it should have been. Wildlife that would normally be audible at night was absent. The acoustic monitors picked up low-frequency sound events that did not match any cataloged animal vocalization in the database they were working from. On the third night, a member of the production crew reported seeing a large shape moving at the edge of the tree line that disappeared before anyone else could get eyes on it. By the fourth day, the team's equipment was registering anomalies that nobody could immediately explain. Thermal hits that appeared and vanished before a clean image could be captured. Ground vibrations that the monitoring equipment logged but that nobody on the team could feel directly. A persistent interference pattern affecting two of their communications devices that the technical team was unable to trace to any known source. None of this was unusual enough on its own to alarm an experienced team, but the accumulation of it over such a short period created a tension in the camp that multiple sources have described as palpable. Something about that stretch of wilderness felt aware of their presence in a way that previous locations never had, and on the fifth night, everything changed. What the cameras captured on that fifth night is the reason this episode was pulled, and the reason everyone connected to it has spent years refusing to discuss it publicly. The thermal imaging unit positioned on the north-facing slope of the ridge above base camp registered a heat signature at approximately 2:17 in the morning that the team's scientist later described in a private communication as the single most significant thermal event ever recorded in the context of Bigfoot research. The signature was bipedal. It was massive. The estimated height based on the imaging data placed the figure at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall with a shoulder width and body mass that ruled out any known North American predator or primate. The figure moved through dense forest at a pace that should have been impossible given the terrain. No stumbling, no hesitation. Fluid, purposeful movement that suggested something completely at home in an environment that would have challenged even an experienced human tracker moving in daylight. The thermal footage ran for 4 minutes and 38 seconds before the figure moved out of the sensor's range. In the final 40 seconds of that footage, a second heat signature appeared on the opposite side of the ridge. Smaller than the first, but still well outside the size range of any known animal in the region. It was stationary, positioned at an elevated point with a direct sightline to the base camp below, watching. The team reached the site at first light, and what they found on the ground stopped the expedition in its tracks. A series of ground impressions pressed deep into the soil in a pattern consistent with bipedal locomotion. The stride length between impressions measured at over 5 feet. Branches on the surrounding trees had been broken at a height of between 7 and 8 feet off the ground, in a pattern that suggested something had been moving through the area at speed. And in the soft earth at the base of a large Douglas fir, the team found biological material, hair, tissue, enough of both to constitute a legitimate sample for DNA analysis. The scientist on site immediately initiated collection protocols. The samples were logged, sealed, and prepared for transport. The footage from the thermal unit was reviewed by the full team that morning, and according to every account of that viewing, the reaction in the room was one of complete and total silence. Nobody had words for what they were looking at, because what they were looking at did not fit any category they had been trained to work within, and that was only the beginning of the problem. The biological material collected at the site that morning was unlike anything the Expedition Bigfoot team had previously recovered during their time in the field. The hair samples were long, coarse, and dark, with a thickness and texture that the collecting scientist noted immediately did not match any North American mammal in the reference catalog she was working from. The tissue sample was small, but intact enough to be considered viable for full genetic sequencing. Standard protocol required the samples to be transported to a certified laboratory within a specific window to preserve their integrity and the team moved quickly to ensure that window was met. The samples left the field site within hours of collection and were transferred through a chain of custody that was documented at every step. The first laboratory to receive the material was a private facility with experience handling wildlife DNA analysis for both commercial and government clients. The initial processing took several days. When the preliminary results came back, the lead analyst on the case requested an internal review before releasing any findings to the production team. That request for an internal review was the first sign that something in the data was not straightforward. When the results were finally shared with the Expedition Bigfoot team, the language used to describe them was careful and heavily qualified. The genetic profile extracted from the samples did not match any species currently cataloged in the reference databases available to the laboratory. It shared certain markers with known primate genetic sequences, but the overall profile was sufficiently distinct that no confident taxonomic identification could be made. In plain terms, the DNA did not belong to anything science had formally documented. The production team requested that the samples be sent to a second independent laboratory for verification without disclosing the findings from the first analysis. The second laboratory conducted its own sequencing independently and reached a conclusion that mirrored the first. Unknown genetic profile. Primate-adjacent markers, no match to any cataloged species. When the two sets of results were placed side by side and reviewed together, the scientist who had been brought in as a consultant reportedly went quiet for a long time before saying anything. What she eventually said was not captured on camera, but the people in that room when she said it have described the moment as the point where the atmosphere of the entire production shifted permanently. The question was no longer whether something had been on that ridge. The question was what that something was and what the existence of its DNA in a verified laboratory report was going to mean for everyone involved. The answer to that question came faster than anyone expected, and it did not come from the science. The timeline between the completion of the banned episode and its disappearance from the broadcast schedule is short, and the sequence of events within that timeline tells a story that is difficult to interpret as anything other than a deliberate and coordinated suppression. The episode was fully edited and delivered to the network in the standard post-production window. It was assigned an air date. Promotional materials were prepared, and then within a period of less than 2 weeks, everything stopped. The air date was quietly removed from the schedule. The promotional materials were pulled. Any reference to the episode in internal communications was systematically scrubbed. People who worked in the production office during that period have described a sudden and complete change in the energy surrounding the show. Conversations that had been open and enthusiastic became closed and careful. Certain topics became off-limits in ways that were never formally stated but were understood by everyone in the room. The cast members were not given a detailed explanation for why the episode was being shelved. They were told it was a production decision, that it was being reviewed, that more information would be provided when available. More information was never provided. What was provided instead were new non-disclosure agreements. Members of the production team who had been present during the filming of the banned episode and during the subsequent DNA analysis process were contacted individually and asked to sign updated legal documents that significantly expanded the scope of what they were prohibited from discussing publicly. The legal language in those documents was described by one former crew member as far more aggressive than anything they had encountered in a standard entertainment industry NDA. It covered not just the footage and the findings, but any conversations, observations, or personal impressions related to the expedition in question. The involvement of outside parties in the decision to pull the episode has never been officially confirmed, but the circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction is substantial. The speed with which legal documents were prepared and distributed suggests that the process was initiated by someone with significant resources and a clear sense of urgency. The network itself has never publicly addressed the missing episode. When pressed by fans and researchers in the years since its disappearance, the standard response has been a variation of no comment or a flat denial that any such episode exists. That denial has only deepened the suspicion of the research community, because the evidence that the episode was filmed, completed, and scheduled is substantial enough that the denial itself requires a level of institutional commitment that goes well beyond standard content management decisions. Something or someone wanted this buried, and they had the reach and the resources to make it happen. In the years since the banned episode disappeared from the broadcast schedule, A small number of individuals connected to the production have attempted to bring what they knew into the public domain. None of them got very far. The pattern that emerges when you look at these cases side by side is consistent enough to suggest that the suppression of this information did not end when the episode was shelved. It has been actively maintained ever since. The first credible attempt to go public came approximately 8 months after the episode was pulled. A former crew member who had been present during the filming and the subsequent DNA review began communicating with a researcher in the Bigfoot community who had been publicly asking questions about the missing episode. The initial exchanges were guarded but substantive. The crew member confirmed that the episode existed, that it had been completed, and that what had been captured during the filming was genuine and significant. They agreed to a recorded conversation. 2 days before that conversation was scheduled to take place, the crew member went silent. Their social media accounts were deleted. Attempts to reach them through mutual contacts went unanswered. The researcher who had been in communication with them has since stated publicly that they believe legal pressure was applied in the intervening period, but that they have no direct evidence to confirm it. A second incident occurred roughly 18 months later when a former post-production employee who had worked on the episode during editing made a series of posts on a now deleted account that described specific details of the footage and the DNA findings in terms that were consistent with what other sources had been saying privately. The posts generated significant attention within the Bigfoot research community before being deleted within 48 hours of going up. The account itself was removed shortly after. The former employee has never publicly reappeared under any identifiable name or account. A third and more recent attempt involved a former consultant connected to the laboratory that processed the initial DNA samples. This individual gave a partial interview to an independent researcher in which they confirmed that anomalous results had been produced from samples connected to a wildlife documentary production, but declined to be more specific. When the researcher attempted to follow up for a second conversation, the consultant stated that they had been advised not to continue and ended all communication. Each of these cases follows the same arc: initial contact, partial disclosure, sudden and complete silence. The timing in every instance suggests external intervention rather than a change of heart, and the consistency of the pattern across multiple individuals over multiple years points to something more organized than a network simply hoping an embarrassing production decision would be forgotten. The story of how the banned episode finally began making its way into the public domain is itself a story of patience, persistence, and a single decision made by someone who had apparently reached the end of their willingness to stay quiet. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way these things typically happen when powerful interests are working to contain them, in fragments, across multiple platforms, through channels that were difficult to trace back to a single source. The first piece of verifiable information to surface publicly was not footage at all. It was a description, a detailed written account posted anonymously to a forum frequented by serious Bigfoot researchers that laid out the basic sequence of events from the expedition with a level of specificity that immediately distinguished it from the speculation and rumor that had been circulating for years. Dates, location details, equipment designations, references to specific team dynamics during the filming, the kind of granular detail that could only have come from someone who was actually there. The post was copied and shared widely before it was taken down, and the copies that survived became the foundation on which subsequent investigations were built. Several months after that initial post, a short clip of what was described as thermal footage began circulating through private channels within the research community. The clip was low resolution, apparently captured from a screen rather than exported directly from the original file, but what it showed was consistent with everything that had been described in the anonymous written account: a large bipedal heat signature moving through dense forest. The clip lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was enough to shift the conversation from rumor to something that demanded a more serious response. Attempts to have the clip authenticated were complicated by its quality, but 2 independent analysts who reviewed it stated that nothing in the footage was inconsistent with a genuine thermal imaging recording and that the signature it showed did not match any known animal. The production company issued a statement in response to the circulating clip that neither confirmed nor denied its authenticity, but described the sharing of proprietary production materials as a potential legal violation. That statement was notable for what it did not say. It did not say the footage was fabricated. It did not say it was from a different production. It addressed the distribution of the material without making any claim about what the material actually was. To many in the research community, that carefully worded non-denial was more revealing than an outright confirmation would have been. In the months that followed, additional details continued to surface through a network of sources that appeared to be coordinating without being directly connected to one another. Descriptions of the DNA findings, accounts of the internal reaction when the results came back, details about the NDA process and the identity of the legal firm involved. The full picture assembled itself slowly, but the direction it pointed was consistent from the beginning. Something real had been captured on that ridge, and the effort to keep it contained was larger and more deliberate than anyone outside the production had previously understood. The response from the broader research community to the surfaced footage and the DNA claims associated with the banned episode has been anything but unified, and that division is itself worth examining closely because it reflects a tension that has existed within the Bigfoot research world for as long as the field has existed. On one side are the researchers and investigators who look at the totality of what has surfaced and conclude that the evidence is too specific, too consistent, and too corroborated across too many independent sources to be dismissed. These are not fringe voices. Several of the individuals who have spoken most forcefully about the credibility of the banned episode material have decades of field experience and academic credentials that would earn them a hearing in any serious scientific context. Their argument is straightforward. The thermal footage is consistent with previous high-credibility Bigfoot thermal events in terms of size, movement pattern, and heat signature distribution. The DNA findings, while extraordinary, follow a pattern that has appeared in previous serious Bigfoot DNA investigations, where samples produced genetic profiles that could not be matched to any known species. And the behavior of the network and production company, in response to the surface material, specifically the careful legal language and the deliberate avoidance of any direct denial, suggests an institutional awareness that the material is genuine and that making false claims about it in a public forum carries legal risk. On the other side are researchers and skeptics who believe the entire story has the structure of a sophisticated content strategy rather than a genuine whistleblower situation. Their argument centers on timing and incentive. The surfacing of the footage and the steady drip of corroborating detail creates exactly the kind of sustained audience engagement that benefits a production looking to generate interest in a new season or a streaming deal. The anonymity of the primary sources makes independent verification impossible, and the DNA claims, while compelling in their specificity, cannot be evaluated directly because the samples and the laboratory reports have never been made available for independent review. What remains when you strip away both the belief and the skepticism is a set of questions that the available evidence cannot yet answer definitively. Was what was captured on that ridge a genuine Bigfoot encounter of a magnitude that has never been documented on camera before? Was the suppression of the episode a response to genuine scientific findings that powerful interests could not afford to become public? Or is the entire arc of this story, from the filming to the burial to the surfacing of the footage, something that was shaped at every stage by hands more interested in audience metrics than in the truth? The honest answer is that nobody outside a very small circle of people knows for certain, and that circle has been remarkably effective at staying quiet. The banned episode still exists somewhere, and the people who know the truth are running out of reasons to stay quiet. NDAs do not last forever, and the pressure on the network to address this story is growing by the day. The research community is not letting this go. More details are surfacing, and the full footage is closer to the public than it has ever been. The only question left is who breaks first. And when they do, nothing will ever be the same for this show or this investigation. Expedition Bigfoot has spent every season going further into the most remote wilderness corridors in North America than any prior Bigfoot investigation has been willing to go. They have documented thermal evidence, physical trace evidence, and acoustic recordings that the scientific community has never adequately addressed. But nothing in the show's prior history prepared the team for what approached them in the dark during this investigation. They did not finish the session. They left. And the footage captured before they did changes everything. Subscribe and stay until the end. Expedition Bigfoot occupies a specific and important position in the landscape of cryptid documentary television that distinguishes it from every comparable production operating in the same genre space. The paranormal and cryptid television market has never been short of content. The cable landscape has sustained an unbroken stream of Bigfoot-adjacent programming across multiple decades, ranging from the credible to the theatrical, whose collective effect on the public understanding of the evidence has been to dilute the serious research record with enough manufactured drama and ambiguous footage that the genuinely significant findings have difficulty being received with the weight they deserve. Expedition Bigfoot was built in deliberate opposition to that dilution. The The show's foundational premise is that the evidence for a large, unknown bipedal primate in North American forest environments is substantial enough to warrant a research approach whose methodology reflects that substantiality. Not trail cameras positioned along popular hiking corridors, not investigators reacting to ambiguous sounds in the dark, but a systematic, technology-driven, scientifically grounded investigation conducted in the locations where the evidence is most concentrated, and by a team whose combined expertise gives the research operation credibility that the genre has historically struggled to claim. Ronnie LeBlanc's investigative background and his sustained personal engagement with the evidence base across years of independent research before the production began gives the show an investigative anchor whose knowledge of the prior evidence record goes deeper than any comparable presenter in the cryptid television space. Dr. Mireya Mayor's academic background as a primatologist and field researcher brings a scientific framework to the investigation that most paranormal productions conspicuously lack. The methodology of a working biologist applied to evidence whose significance her professional training gives her the tools to assess with a precision that general investigators cannot match. The combination of those two figures, supported by a research and technical team whose fieldwork capability extends the investigation's reach into terrain and conditions that standard documentary productions cannot access, has produced across the show's seasons the most credible body of documented Bigfoot field research ever captured for broadcast television. What the team encountered during the investigation that produced the footage, this video documents exceeded everything that prior credibility had prepared them for, and the footage they captured before they left is the reason this video exists. The specific location where the Expedition Bigfoot team conducted the investigation that ended in a full team departure was not selected through the standard development process that drives most television production location choices. It was selected at the end of a research process whose depth and rigor reflected the production's commitment to operating in the locations where the evidence was most concentrated, rather than in the locations that were most accessible or most visually suited to the documentary format. The location selection process for this investigation drew on 3 independent bodies of evidence that converged on the same geographic area from different research directions. The first was the physical evidence record, the accumulation of track castings, biological samples, and structural evidence from the area that the prior field research literature had documented across a span of decades without any systematic investigation having followed up on the individual findings comprehensively. The track castings from this area showed the dermal ridge detail and the anatomical proportions that the forensic literature on physical Bigfoot evidence identifies as markers of genuine biological impressions, and they were distributed across the area in a pattern consistent with a resident population whose territorial range centered on the specific drainage system the production identified as its primary investigation zone. The second body of evidence was the acoustic record. Recordings produced by independent researchers working the area across the prior decade documented vocalizations in the frequency ranges associated with large primate communication that the standard biological reference for the region's wildlife could not account for. The frequency analysis of those recordings, conducted by an audio specialist whose professional background in acoustic analysis was unconnected to cryptozoological research, produced findings consistent with a vocal apparatus significantly larger than any known North American animal species and carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization in the region. The third body of evidence was the witness testimony, the accumulation of independent encounter reports from hunters, forestry workers, and outdoor recreation users whose accounts of the area were consistent across independent observations, separated by years of time, and whose descriptions of what they had seen, heard, and physically encountered were detailed enough and specific enough to indicate genuine observation rather than the generalized impressions that misidentification produces. The convergence of those 3 independent evidence streams on the same geographic area is what the production identified as the most significant location indicator in the show's research history. It was the most evidentially supported single location the show had ever targeted for a full investigation deployment, and what that deployment produced exceeded everything the prior evidence record had suggested would be waiting there. The Expedition Bigfoot team arrived at the investigation location with the full weight of the production's technical capability deployed. The thermal imaging infrastructure, the acoustic monitoring network, the track documentation equipment, and the biological sample collection resources that the show's prior seasons had developed into the most sophisticated Bigfoot field investigation toolkit in the history of organized research into the phenomenon. The deployment methodology reflected the lessons the prior seasons had accumulated about how the subject behaved in relation to investigation activity, the awareness of human presence that the prior field evidence consistently indicated, the behavioral sophistication that the track pattern analysis and the acoustic record suggested, and the specific environmental conditions under which encounter probability was highest based on the accumulated field data. The baseline documentation conducted across the investigation's initial phase established an environmental profile for the target zone that the technical team's field notes describe as unlike anything the prior season's investigation deployments had produced. The acoustic sensors logged vocalizations in the infrasound range within the first hours of the deployment that the production's audio specialist identified as structural, not random low-frequency noise but organized sound whose internal patterning was consistent with communication rather than incidental environmental production. The thermal cameras covering the perimeter of the camp logged the first anomalous heat signatures at the edge of the tree line before the team had completed their initial site assessment, signatures whose dimensions and movement characteristics the operator flagged in real time as inconsistent with any animal in the biological reference database for the region. The track documentation team working the creek drainage adjacent to the primary camp position found fresh evidence of activity in the soft ground along the bank whose characteristics, the size, the stride pattern, the pressure distribution, were consistent with the physical evidence record that had driven the location selection, and whose freshness indicated that whatever had produced it had been in the area within hours of the team's arrival. The subject of the investigation knew the team was there before the team had finished setting up, and the signs it was producing in response to their presence were not the incidental byproducts of an animal going about its ordinary activity. They were deliberate. They were directed, and they were escalating. The investigation's night sessions are the operational core of the Expedition Bigfoot methodology, the periods when the thermal imaging capability is most relevant, when the acoustic monitoring is most productive, and when the behavioral evidence from the prior field research suggests encounter probability is highest. The night session that produced the footage this video documents began with the same systematic deployment the production's prior seasons had established as standard procedure. Thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridors, acoustic sensors running across the full frequency spectrum, the team positioned at the locations the prior day's evidence collection had identified as the most active zones of the investigation area. The first hour of the session produced evidence in every instrument category that the technical team's field notes describe as the most concentrated body of simultaneous anomalous readings any single Expedition Bigfoot investigation session had previously generated. The acoustic sensors logged a progression of vocalizations beginning at the perimeter of the investigation area and moving systematically closer across the first 40 minutes of the session, a progression whose directional consistency and whose escalating proximity the audio specialist documented as indicating deliberate movement toward the team's position rather than the random distribution of an animal moving through its territory. The thermal cameras confirmed the directional movement the acoustic data was tracking. Heat signatures at the tree line, initially at the outer range of the camera's resolution capability, then progressively closer as the session advanced, moved with the purposeful, fluid locomotion that the prior season's encounter footage had established as the thermal signature of the subject the investigation was deployed to document. The ground was soft enough in the primary approach corridor to preserve the physical trace of the movement the cameras were tracking, and the track documentation equipment running in that corridor logged impressions whose freshness and whose anatomical detail gave the investigation a real-time physical record of the subject's approach that the prior seasons had never achieved simultaneously with active thermal and acoustic documentation. Everything was aligned. Every instrument category was producing consistent, corroborating data. The investigation was performing exactly as the methodology had been designed to perform. And then, at the 51-minute mark of the session, the data changed in a way that the methodology had not been designed to account for. The change in the investigation data at the 51-minute mark of the night session is the pivot point of the banned episode footage and the specific development whose character produced the team's departure decision. The thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridor had been tracking movement at the tree line for 40 minutes. movement whose proximity had been increasing incrementally across that period in a pattern consistent with a subject methodically closing the distance between itself and the investigation team's position. At 51 minutes, the incremental pattern ended. The thermal signature that had been approaching from the tree line was no longer at the tree line. The camera covering the primary approach corridor registered its presence at a distance from the team's position that the 40 minutes of incremental approach had not prepared anyone monitoring the data to expect. The distance had collapsed in a single movement whose speed the camera's frame rate captured without any intermediate frames showing the transition, present at the tree line in one frame, present at the investigation team's position in the next. The acoustic sensors logged a simultaneous change at the same moment, not an escalation of the vocalization pattern that had been building across the session, but a cessation. The structured infrasound communication that had been running continuously since the session began stopped at 51 minutes with a completeness that the audio specialist's field notes describe as more significant than any vocalization the sensors had recorded. Silence in this context was not the absence of activity. It was a specific communication. Something had decided the distance was no longer necessary. The thermal profile of what the cameras documented at close range at 51 minutes is the element of the footage that has been described by every person who has reviewed it with the most careful and the most consistent language. It is large. Larger than the team, larger than the prior season's thermal documentation had established as the upper range of the subject's documented size profile. Its heat distribution is consistent with a large warm-blooded organism whose core temperature and peripheral thermal radiation pattern are unlike any known species in the reference database the production's thermal imaging specialist had consulted across the prior seasons. And it was stationary, not moving toward the team, not moving away, standing between the team's position and the tree line in a stillness that the prior encounter footage had never documented in a subject at this proximity. The stillness of something that had reached the distance it intended to reach and was occupying it with a patience and a deliberateness that communicated more clearly than any behavior the prior investigation record contained what its purpose at that distance was. The Expedition Bigfoot team's response to what the cameras documented at 51 minutes into the night session is captured in the footage with an intimacy that the production's camera deployment, multiple units covering the team's position as well as the approach corridor, makes unusually comprehensive. The initial response of every team member in the frame at the 51-minute mark is consistent across every independent account of the session that has surfaced. A simultaneous shift in the quality of attention that the team was directing toward the investigation that preceded any verbal communication about what the data was showing. The people in that footage did not look at an instrument reading and then react. They were already reacting before anyone had said anything about what the instrument showed. Whatever the thermal cameras documented at 51 minutes at close range was not only visible in the camera data, it was present in the environment of the investigation area in a way that the team members closest to the primary approach corridor were registering through senses that the instrument data was only confirming. Dr. Mayor's response is the most analytically significant element of the team's documented behavior during the relevant period, not because it is the most dramatically visible, but because her professional background gives it the most evidential weight. A primatologist with field research experience across multiple continents, whose professional career has required sustained close proximity to large primate species in their natural environments, responding to what was present in the investigation area at 51 minutes with the specific quality of physical stillness that the cameras document, is communicating something about the nature of what was there that her decades of professional experience with known primate species had not produced in any prior field context. The decision to end the session was not made through the standard production protocol of a director communicating an editorial decision to the team. It was made by the team simultaneously, and without the verbal coordination that group decisions normally require. Every account of the decision that has surfaced describes it the same way. Not a decision that was reached, but a decision that was already made before anyone articulated it. The equipment was packed in a sequence whose efficiency communicated the team's collective understanding that the pace of the departure was not negotiable. The cameras kept rolling through the packing process and through the team's movement out of the investigation area. What they captured in the frames between the departure decision and the moment the team reached the vehicles is the element of the footage that has been described by people who have reviewed it as the most significant evidence the session produced, because in those frames, what had been standing between the team and the tree line at 51 minutes was still there. The body of evidence produced by the Expedition Bigfoot investigation session before the team's departure represents the most comprehensive simultaneous documentation of large unknown primate activity in the history of organized Bigfoot field research. And it is comprehensive precisely because the methodology the production had developed across its prior seasons was running at full deployment capacity when the subject closed the distance at 51 minutes. The thermal imaging data from the session establishes a heat signature profile for the subject that the production's thermal imaging specialist has described in the technical documentation as outside every reference category in the database while being internally consistent. The same profile, the same heat distribution pattern, the same dimensional characteristics across every camera angle and every frame of the relevant sequence. The consistency of the profile across independent camera units eliminates every artifact and equipment anomaly explanation for what the cameras documented. The acoustic data from the session establishes a vocalization record whose frequency analysis is consistent with the prior research literature's findings on Bigfoot acoustic evidence, a vocal production capability exceeding the range of any known North American animal, carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization, and organized with the internal structure that the prior acoustic research identified as communication rather than incidental sound production. The track evidence documented in the primary approach corridor establishes a physical record of the subject's movement toward the team's position that is consistent across every forensic measure the documentation equipment applied to it. The dermal ridge detail in the freshest impressions confirms biological production. The pressure distribution analysis confirms the mass and the locomotion pattern the thermal data independently establishes, and the stride pattern analysis confirms the directional movement the acoustic data tracked across the first 40 minutes of the session. 3 independent evidence streams, thermal, acoustic, and physical, all documenting the same subject in the same location across the same time period, producing results that are mutually consistent and that none of the conventional explanations available for any individual stream can account for when applied to the full body of evidence the session generated. This is the evidential standard that the Bigfoot research community has been working toward across decades of organized field investigation. The Expedition Bigfoot session produced it, and what the team encountered at 51 minutes when the subject closed the distance is the reason the footage from that session is the most significant thing the show has ever captured. The Expedition Bigfoot session footage was presented to a carefully selected group of researchers whose backgrounds in relevant disciplines, thermal imaging analysis, acoustic research, primate biology, and forensic track analysis, gave them the technical framework to engage with the evidence in each of its categories with professional rigor. The selection process was designed to exclude researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would have given either their positive or negative assessments a credibility problem in the broader research community. What was wanted was not validation from committed believers or dismissal from committed skeptics. What was wanted was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior public record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The thermal imaging analysis conducted by the specialist engaged for that review produced findings whose specific language, carefully chosen by a professional who understood the implications of every word, established that the footage was authentic, that the heat signature documented in the relevant sequence had no conventional explanation in the thermal imaging reference literature, and that the profile characteristics of the signature were inconsistent with every known species in every database the analyst had access to. The acoustic analysis produced findings consistent with the prior research literature on Bigfoot vocalizations, while exceeding the evidential quality of every prior acoustic sample in that literature in terms of recording clarity, frequency resolution, and the comprehensiveness of the concurrent documentation that allowed the vocalizations to be analyzed in the context of the full investigation data rather than as isolated recordings. The track analysis produced the most conservative characterization of the three. Forensic track analysts are professionally trained to resist conclusions that exceed the evidence, and the analyst engaged for this review applied that training consistently. What they would say was that the impressions documented in the primary approach corridor were consistent with a large bipedal primate whose foot morphology did not match any known species, and whose mass and locomotion pattern the pressure distribution analysis established at levels inconsistent with human production. What they would not say was what species had produced them. That restraint is itself the most scientifically honest response available to the evidence, and it is more significant, coming from a forensic professional applying rigorous methodology, than any unqualified confirmation would have been. Expedition Bigfoot went further than any prior investigation. The prior seasons built the methodology. This session used it. What came out of the dark to meet the team at 51 minutes is on camera. The question the show has been asking since season 1 has an answer. It came to them.